So this is fantastic. Marcie Sclove, thank you so much for joining us today on So Ask Us. For everyone who's tuning in, we're talking with Marcie today, and I'm going to read from my list because I don't want to miss anything, because Marcie, you have so many things that you do, so many things going on. We're going to try and talk about all of it in 45 minutes. We'll see how we do. But for everyone tuning in, Marcie is a producer of Going Deeper TV show and podcast, talking to people, getting to know them and their history better. So she and I are getting to connect on this interviewer to interviewer level today, which I'm really excited about. She's also chair of the Racial Justice Task Force with the League of Women Voters in Amherst. She is a hospital chaplain, former owner of Marcie's Place restaurant, which I'm sure people watching remember lovingly, and a very long time resident of Amherst. So we're going to go in so many different directions. Marcie, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
This is so exciting. And I'm going to start, if it's okay, with the sort of interviewer to interviewer, because this is the first time that I'm getting to talk to someone who sometimes sits where I'm sitting. And so I'm curious first, what is it like for you to be on this side of the interview?
I'm happy to do it. I often have thought I have a lot, to say, so it would be nice to be interviewed. It also reminds me of Isaac Ben Ezra, who passed, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago now. And he had a really big interview show for 18 years or something on Amherst Media. And he showed up to me one day and said, I want you to interview me. And it was such an honor. And it was like, yeah. And we did a great interview, and, it gave him a chance to be in his life instead of always looking at the other person's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And I'm glad that he reached out and asked, because I think it's easy sometimes as the interviewer to sort of push down some of the things we want to say. I'm curious, in your own interviewing, how much do you find yourself kind of weaving in either your own opinion or, an additional point or a counterpoint? How do you bring yourself into the conversation, even when you're holding space for someone else?
It's a good question. I think that it has evolved for me. I've done now about 35 interviews starting in 2014. And at first, I think I just kept the container open more. And slowly I would say a little bit more, in response to something or at a point, but there is, I think that my whole thing is presence. So if you are present in an interview, you do show up by responding or, and not taking all the attention, obviously, away from who you're interviewing, but being a participant.
Yeah.
Really it's a fine line. It is a fine line. Yeah.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And so I'm curious, you brought up evolution, and, I've just listed off a bunch of different things that you do. Can you share with us a little bit your path, how it has evolved over time for you to be where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So I was trained as a professional chef, and I worked in the food industry for 30 years.
Yeah.
Many different kinds of experiences, including being a chef of a French and Italian restaurant in Ann Arbor, and teaching cooking in a culinary school in Boston area. I worked in France making foie gras in the south of France for a year. I ran a diner in Cambridge, which was one of my favorite jobs. And
what is it about diners?
Yeah, diners are the best. That's where I met my husband. That's where I met a bunch of dear friends. And it was a very powerful experience of being a place that was a third place. And sociology talks about third places.
Yeah.
It also cut across class lines, because depending on what time the coffee break was that people came to the diner, they got to know each other. It's like that.
Yeah.
So I opened my own restaurant in Amherst in 1988. And it was kind of a synthesis of all my experiences.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's what I did for, many years, was cooking my own restaurant. And then my last cooking job was running the soup kitchen at the Survival Center for 4 years.
Right.
And the thing that was so really, giving me a lot of insight was how similar my customers at my restaurant were to my
Mm.
customers at the soup kitchen.
Ah,
And,
glad you
you
said
were,
that.
you were asking me about, something that related to how people are the same or how people are different.
Yeah.
And, you know, around food, people are pretty much the same.
I,
They
yeah.
know what they want, they know what they feel is healthy for them or what they want to eat anyway. And no matter what the venue is. So that was an important transition for me. And then
Mm,
my family moved to India for a year. And when I
wow.
got back from India, I wanted to recreate the authenticity and the vibrancy and the life of India. And
Yeah.
it's pretty flat around here compared to life in India. The places where I feel you really are in the thick of life is
Yeah.
birth and then death,
Ooh,
and in between, people who really have to struggle.
yeah.
So I came back and I did a bunch of trainings. I became a doula for a little while, and I was a doula for about 14 or 15 births. And
Wow.
I also trained to be a volunteer hospice person who would, help out at death at the
Yeah.
bedside. And between the survival center, doula work, and hospice work, I really did feel that sense of vibrancy.
Yeah.
And then I shifted into hospital chaplaincy, and I did some training with that with clinical pastoral education, CPE. There's a
Okay.
formal training that's done. And a friend who came to my 60th birthday party made an insight about me, which I really loved, because
Yeah.
he said how it seems like I've done all these different things, but how really they were all versions of the same thing.
Mm,
And that rings true for me. My restaurant work was really about connection and relation and seeing people, acknowledging people, knowing them.
yeah.
We had a lot of regulars. I knew people's names.
Right.
I knew how they liked their food, who had allergies, stuff like that. And then moving all the way through to chaplaincy work, it's all kind of the same.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not the venue of nurturing them with food, but
Right.
with your presence. And so I feel like, and then my TV show, Going Deeper, was just another manifestation of the chaplaincy work.
Yeah.
And having another way to have authentic conversations with people.
Yeah. It's so wonderful. And how lovely to have someone in your life that was able to kind of reflect that, because I
Yeah.
completely agree. I mean, it's really, and I find a lot of similarities when you and I are talking. We've had an opportunity to talk once before, and now we're talking today.
Yeah.
I find a lot of similarities between the work that we do. I mean, placemaking is very much about, if I create the container, people pour themselves into it. And that really, I think, is so valuable, because the container does have to be created, whether it's the restaurant or it's the show or it's, even a board that you might be on. You are kind of holding a space and inviting people
Right.
into it, and then encouraging them to be themselves, to live fully, all the other things that you're able to bring into it because of who you are.
So another example of that, which I'm reminded by what you're just saying, is I also run a conversation circle for the ESL program at the Jones Library.
Oh, how cool.
And that is definitely a container for people to just come and feel safe, to make mistakes and to, struggle through English.
Yeah.
Now that we're on Zoom, we have people who are physically in Amherst,
right?
But we also have people who were in Amherst and have gone home to China, to Brazil, to Japan, to Pakistan.
Yeah.
All these places, Mexico, all these different places. And again, it's that notion of creating some kind of a container. People really need to feel seen and to be seen, not just feel it, but to be acknowledged. And I think that that's been another theme through my professional life is just different ways that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And seeing people sometimes in some really hard moments. I mean, birth moments, death moments, moments of, disagreement or difficult conversations, because you do a lot of work, I know, around racial justice and social change, and spaces where people sometimes can be at odds even with people they agree with because emotion is high. I mean, how do you sort of navigate both for yourself and for other people that are in these spaces that you're a part of? How do you navigate really encouraging that empathetic ear or that empathetic listening? I mean, seeing someone, I think, is so much about being able to empathize and say, I see you, I see our similarities, I see our differences, I'm relating. How do you kind of navigate that and either, I don't know, verbalize it to people and help them, or just energetically kind of make sure people are feeling welcome in this way?
So I have two answers to that. And of course, I'm going to forget what they are.
I have Post-its everywhere, always, all time.
I think that in terms of empathy, the first lesson that has carried me through my whole life is about making relationships.
Yeah.
So that is really about, like, you meet someone that you're not familiar with, where they're from or their class or like whatever.
Yeah.
And then as you get to know them, all of those categories literally fall away.
Right.
And you forget, oh yeah, that person is such and such, and I don't like that such and such, or whatever. Yeah. So that's one thing, is just really moving outside of our own comfort zone of who our friends are or who are, our most obvious relational people are, either through a religion or through whatever.
Yeah, I love that way of saying it, the most obvious relational people.
Yeah, so moving away from that. So relationships, that's one. And number two, I have been steeping myself in this podcast. I'm really trying to learn a lot.
Yeah.
And empathy for me is now in my life. I wasn't a history person, growing up, or that wasn't, I don't think we learned the right things in schools about history. Yeah. So I'm steeping myself right now in this podcast called Scene On, SCENE, Scene On. And the series is called Seeing Whiteness. And I'm learning a lot about how historically there were always slaves. The first slaves were Slavic, hence the word slave comes from Slavic, which is white people.
Yeah.
So, what happened, especially in this country, what happened to create this construct that white people and Black people are enemies or are separate from each other?
Yeah.
And other groups being separate from each other. It's all really a narrative that was created from the get-go with the Native Americans
Yeah.
for the white settlers to acquire land and money and power.
Right.
And you can see it all over the world, even today, that when there are these conflicts, what is the underlying thing? And if I look at who's got the power, who's looking for power, who's got the money, who's got resources that people want, it's very interesting. So even like, I'm a Democrat. I'm happy that Biden won. I've been appalled at Trump. But like, how do I now move away from this polarization? And when somehow this on seeing whiteness is helping me have compassion for poor white people, and more poor white people than rich white people who are benefiting from Trump. But nonetheless, I'm trying to get there.
Yeah.
And with the poor white people or middle-class white people who feel threatened, I'm just trying to understand, like, we all got told this story of who is threatening us and what we need to do to keep our place.
Yeah.
So, and I'm also reading a lot, and this is my next read, Caste, which is the second book by Isabel Wilkerson. And she wrote, The Warmth of Other Suns. So she's trying to explain also this sense of like this hierarchy, and how everyone wants to be above the next level. And, so in terms of getting back to empathy, it helps me to just not buy into, I still, I feel fearful at some of the violent, angry aggressiveness of Trump supporters with assault rifles hanging off their shoulders. That scares me. But when I think about what got them there, my best self is trying to understand they were duped. We were duped. It's really about Koch brothers, and before them, all of the other entities with power and money who manipulated things so that we would all be against each other.
So really finding those places of connection and commonality that do exist. And
I think knowing history is helpful to even try to get. The other thing is we're all so segregated. Like, I don't really have any people in my family or in my my networks who are Trump supporters. So I don't really have the dialogue that I want other people to have, or that I hope I could have in a skillful way. I don't have a lot of experience with it, and I hope that I could do a good job. And, these things that I'm saying that I hope they would be true for me when I'm in a situation like that, up against people that I don't agree with.
When you're sort of in conversation with either people that you're, on the board with, or, meeting in different instances, are there questions that you sort of encourage people or would suggest that people ask each other, or ways that you have found to get into, not even necessarily a debate, not even like you believe this and I believe this, but real questions of like curiosity? Who are you, and how did we come to find ourselves in this space together today? What do you care about? What do I care about? How do you encourage people through your work, or even in yourself, to get to some of the realness about who we are as people, rather than the stories?
No, it's a good question. What's been coming up for me as a question is, what do you need? What do you need? And I think people, and also listening more than speaking. There's a wonderful educator who's been in the Valley for a while, and now she's back in Atlanta. Her name is Loretta Ross. And she did a recent webinar for the UMass School of Public Health on calling in, calling out. And this notion of calling out, which then, there's this quality of being PC that, somebody is not speaking politically correctly enough. And some of that is just fighting.
Yeah.
But some of it has some truth to it. And even among liberals or progressive, there is this way of like calling people out without giving them the space. When you call people in, the way you're saying, how can we talk to each other that brings us in rather than puts up the wall? And for me, that's a good question. What do you need? How can I see you better?
Right. And to be very clear, because I think clarity is so important right now, to be very clear, not just, asking someone what they need as in, I have resources that I can share with you and, this and that, that whole thing that I'm sure since you're taking,
no, you're right. That's a tricky line. Yeah.
It's a tricky line, but also I think what comes up for me is encouraging people not to jump to that conclusion that that's what you need. Also, that sometimes the needs we have, sometimes they're tangible needs, and I could use this and I could use that, but sometimes they're needs about being heard or about being seen, and
that's what I'm saying.
And can open up a conversation for someone where they're, I think I feel this a lot in my life where someone will say to me, "What do you need?" And I'm like,
I don't even know.
And
and I think the question would come after the listening and the building trust. I have an old memory from the Survival Center. This was a long time ago when we just started the program over there of giving away produce and stuff every day. It was an offshoot of going out to stores and getting all the goods, day old fresh stuff that we would use to make lunch. And then what was left, we started giving it away as a distribution, which you didn't have to, it didn't come through the pantry. You didn't have to live in a certain place or qualify. Anybody could take it. And there were these older Chinese women who were really aggressive and would push. And we had to come up with more and more constrained systems, procedures, like now they give out a ticket, all of that was evolving. And then we realized who these women were and what was their history, and that they had gone through the Cultural Revolution in China. And that they had lost, everything and didn't have enough food. So, food always brings out the best or the worst, the anxiety. But once I understood, then I could respond differently. And that's what I mean.
Rude or
like, gosh, instead of that, it could be like, okay, there's enough here. There'll be plenty. Everyone's going to get the, a fair share. There's no, all of those ways of making it safe and fair.
And understanding the root cause of it.
Exactly.
Understanding the root of it. And the Survival Center, I think, is it's a wonderful organization, and it's very front and center for me because they're our neighbor in the Mill District. And so I get to work with Lev Ben Ezra and her whole team. Second time that family's come up in this conversation.
I know, Isaac's granddaughter.
And she and I have had a lot of conversations about breaking down stigma, really helping folks understand that, people go to the Survival Center for all different reasons. And especially during COVID, there has been a huge spike in need. And how do we continue to make it clear that the Survival Center is actually not just about survival necessarily? Sometimes it's just that you're having a hard month, and you might not feel even about yourself that you're on the edge of something, but them being there and your ability to see that as a place that you're willing to go, that's for you.
Yeah, but Hannah, it's even more deep than that.
Oh, tell me. I want to know.
I mean, I'm not as involved as I used to, but the premise of the Survival Center was that people not only needed food and clothing and medical care now,
Right.
not then, but now, or any of those resources, but they needed an opportunity to shine, that their gifts would be accepted and offered. Not this notion of giving back
Yeah.
necessarily,
Yeah.
but the same way that we all feel really great when you're going to feel so good at the end of this interview, like, wow, I did
I
this
do.
thing, you know, and we all love to see ourselves shine in
Mm.
our qualities, in our gifts, in our smarts, in our whatever.
Yeah.
And everyone needs that ability, that opportunity to have that come through. So
Mm.
it's not just that the Survival Center, you might have a hard month and you don't want, yeah, poverty, stigma around poverty sucks. And it is
Yeah.
a real thing, and
Yeah.
people feel that, and it's very destructive. But
Yeah.
also, the more that people know, like when I worked there, all of the people who made the food, the lunches, were people who used the services,
Making use of it. Yeah. Yeah.
and everyone there was considered a volunteer. Either they were volunteers
Yeah.
or they were potential volunteers,
Yeah.
and that included people with severe disabilities. It included PTSD, Vietnam veterans. It included working people who would come after work. It included immigrants who came and English was not their first language. So
Right.
many reasons people were coming. And they were in poverty because of the system, not because of themselves. And
Mhm.
that's another way that, the narrative works against people who, the narrative is that poverty comes because you're not good enough. You
Right.
haven't pulled yourself up enough.
Oh, I hate
You're
that
not
narrative.
smart enough,
Oh.
whatever. When in fact, it's the system, that there aren't enough jobs and there's not enough pay for the jobs. And there's, there are all these obstacles. There's not enough good housing. There's so many obstacles.
Right.
So when people take in that oppressive, they internalize that oppression, of course they feel stigma, but
Right.
instead there could be, and there have been at times, and maybe that exists now still,
Mhm.
a pride of like, it was an amazing community. I
Yeah.
learned so much from people who came there.
Mm.
And when I talk about the realness after India, it's not because they were poor, it was because of their resilience and their smarts and their ability to make things out of nothing, and
Mm.
managing time and managing their resources and
Mm.
taking care of their kids and so many things at once,
Mm.
and being kind to each other.
Yes.
We had our problems, and there were
Yeah.
times when there might be somebody who had to be kicked out or whatever, but for the most part, people were
Yeah.
very respectful and very kind to each other.
Yeah. Ah, that's awesome. I'm glad that you shared all of that because that is the deeper layer, and I think it's so, so crucial. And
Yeah.
I have a question from Shalini Ball who's watching. Hi, Shalini. Thank you for tuning in. I love when you're here. She shared that she's really loving the conversation. And she wanted to ask, understanding racism is such a deep and complex issue, and it takes time. And in this culture of kind of quick fixes, how do we get people to invest time in trainings to really immerse themselves in self-reflection, understand the history that you're talking about, history that's very different from what we were all taught, and really see the interconnectedness of multiple issues that allow systems of racism to perpetuate. And so if
Wow.
you can, I know it's a big question, giant question, but turning the conversation to the work that you're doing now with the Racial Justice Task
Yeah.
Force, and I know you also do work with the True School. You know, how do we continue to encourage people to take that time to reflect on things that often can be very painful to see in
Sure.
themselves or to see in other people? And
Well,
yeah,
first of all, these episodes of Seeing Whiteness are
yeah,
like 20, 25 minutes each.
okay,
So if you're taking a walk with your dog or
yep,
whatever, or you're,
by yourself, yep,
go just like, I like to be in nature and not have, input sometimes, but
yeah,
I do also, if I'm in the car, so they're podcasts and you can
yeah,
download them. That's one thing. Reading
yes. I
this,
read that book. That book is so good that you're holding.
yeah. So
Yeah,
Kendi is now a wonderful thinker. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a wonderful thinker.
yeah,
Uh, I think that just hearing other voices, Black voices, in my case, that's where I'm focusing right now, is African American relations and studies.
yeah,
Lumping everybody together as people of color or even BIPOC, it's more complicated than that. What
yeah,
I'm learning in this podcast is all of these groups, they came from different places, and they had different cultures, and that they didn't identify as one thing. So
right,
why would they now want to identify, why do Latinx want to identify Cubans with Mexicans and Venezuelans and, Hondurans? Like, they're all
right.
different
All
cultures in a
different.
way.
Yeah, yeah,
So locally, let's get to the
yeah,
local. So Amherst is, making this attempt through the council to shine a light on racial equity. The town manager has a whole new list of evaluation requirements when he gets evaluated next year that are based on racial stuff. And how
wow,
is he doing in town? How is the town doing?
yeah,
And in my task force, some of our members did a research study just to sort of get a baseline. What is the report cards, that in quotations, where
yeah,
are we? Where do we stand now? And they looked at a lot of different metrics: health, schools, housing, the census.
hmm,
And basically what they found was that there was no fundamentally accurate information for Amherst. The
right,
data, the quantitative data, is combined with UMass,
right,
which skews everything. And there isn't really, except for the schools, the public schools, because it's
hmm,
mandated by the state.
right, to evaluate.
It's mandated by the state. And at this moment, we're hoping to change this, but at this moment, you can't even get a link on the Amherst Regional School website to this study in the state. But
Wow,
what we found was that the data isn't available publicly. So this also includes police data,
yeah,
biracial, and then the question is, who gets to identify if a police officer pulls you over and misidentifies you,
hmm,
then, so like all of these layers, right? So they found out this was the answer, that there doesn't exist data. So they said, okay, we'll just put this project on the shelf.
oh,
And I said, like,
no,
no, this is in itself evidence of institutional racism,
mm,
that we
got it.
don't have this information, that we can then use it. Okay, fine. So our hope, and this is actually the first time it's coming out in such a public way. We have spoken to the town manager. We are speaking with the council. We're making, overtures to the Amherst Racial Equity Task Force and to the Human Rights Commission and all, to
Yeah,
the school system all over. But the point is that getting the data accurately
yeah,
is not in itself the answer. And that is where a lot of people say, okay, well, then we're done. No, data is just a tool.
Yeah.
And if we want Amherst government and community, we want to put them to the fire to really make change for
Yeah.
racial equity in Amherst, then this is a tool that then will show, are we improving or not?
Right.
Is there a commitment or not?
Mm.
And that is the ultimate goal of our task force, is to
Yeah.
push that agenda further. And we're not working alone. You know, there are many groups in Amherst that are working on this stuff.
Right.
I wish we all worked together a little better and
Mhm.
communicated a little better. And the league, which has a very good reputation for having a process and being very methodical and not flying off the handle and being a
Mhm.
forum for this kind of discourse, we, you know, are perceived and truly, mostly, not entirely, we have wonderful people of color, you know, in our membership, but
Yeah.
we are perceived mostly as a white organization.
Mm.
And we don't want to once again be the white people who are coming in with
Right.
all the answers. No, we want people who have had the experience to be able to qualitatively
Yeah.
share, and that there be quantitative data
Yeah.
to back up whether or not there is change, that
Right.
we're seeing change.
Right. Ooh, that is
So whew, that was
right. It's a tall order. I mean, and I just in hearing you talk about this, there's so much work happening, just kind of like peeling layers back at a pace that I think most people are not accustomed to. Uh-oh. Oh, I lost you.
no, I'm here.
Okay.
I was trying to avoid that phone ringing in
Oh,
the
totally
background.
cool.
It's almost done. Okay, now it's done, I think. Yeah. Yeah, it's a tall order, but you know, we think of ourselves in Amherst as progressive and
Right.
liberal and on the right side of things,
Right.
and not poor.
Mm.
You know, we don't really realize that where we stand in the state in poverty. I think we're in the top 10
Yeah.
towns.
Yeah.
We have so many different languages that the kids are speaking in schools.
Yeah.
There's so much diversity, but a lot of the public space is still perceived as white space.
Yeah.
That's why, like, I love the idea of, you know, the story walk, for instance.
Yeah.
It's such a great idea, and it's so cool to bring literacy and literature into
Yeah.
nature and all of that. I would love to see books with Black and brown faces in the
Yes.
stories.
Yeah.
Julius Lester is his trail.
I know. I was just gonna say, so for everyone watching, the way that you and I first connected is that when word of the story walk got out, you reached out to me and you said, did you know that this trail is, you know, in honor of this man, his life, his legacy. He wrote children's books, which I have to admit, I didn't even know when I chose that
Wow.
trail. I chose that trail because it was the most accessible for differently abled people. I was looking at trails all over North Amherst originally. It was going to be on the Robert Frost Trail, which is on Cole's owned land, which is the company that I work for. And so there were no permissions to get. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. And I went out and I walked it and I said, there's no way that kids are coming out here. There's no way someone with a stroller or a wheelchair or a walker is coming out here. We have to be somewhere that is really accessible. So it actually was sort of a happy accident that it came to be on the Julius Lester Trail, and you reached out and I learned so much more about him, and you had done a wonderful interview with him when he was living, and it just was you know, it felt to me like in my new agey way, kind of like the universe being like, this was the right place and you were
Yeah.
on the right path and you didn't even really know it,
Yeah.
you know?
Well,
And
Julius wrote 30 children's books, 30
it's
children's
amazing.
books.
It's
And
amazing. I'm so excited to post.
some of them are for young adults and teenage. I mean, he rewrote Shakespeare for young adults.
Oh
He
my
was just a
God.
brilliant person. But I do have 3 of his books. It's like a little like I'm in the library right now.
Right? It's like we're on Reading Rainbow. Did you ever watch that show? I love that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And then this one, Sam and the Tigers. This is one I think I want to push you to do.
Yes, it's on my list.
And then this one, I love this, Shining. It is such a gorgeous book about a little girl and his
Uh-huh.
language. I mean, Julius was a musician and, you know, he came from the home of a preacher. And
Hmm.
his use of language is like, it's like jazz.
Yeah.
And in this book, Shining, he uses all this language to describe Blackness in beautiful language, poetic language. You know, we owe
Yeah.
so much. I even hear about it in so many different areas. The idea of darkness,
Hmm.
of Blackness being negative,
Mm.
and lightness, whiteness, that's like a spiritual goal. It's
Right.
you know, in so many different areas, I
Yeah.
hear this kind of thing. Even like in Harry Potter, I remember one of the villains was Mr. Black, was his name.
Yeah.
And
Serious.
when my
I
daughter was
thought,
little, I was like, okay, enough already with you, mommy, you know, and all of your thinking about that. But that is embedded in our language, that Blackness and darkness is a bad thing. And
right.
he puts that on its head in this
Yeah.
gorgeous story. She's also silent. And it's really another way he's using the almost musical idea of sound and silence.
Yeah.
And it's just like poetry. It's
Ooh,
gorgeous. So, and there are so many more, Hannah.
yeah. Uh,
You could do like one after the next of Julius Lester books on
well,
his trail.
I was gonna say, I think it, you know, makes a lot of sense to kind of return to his opus and keep sort of posting, you know, even if it's one every 6 books or something is his, because all of the books that are going to be posted on the story trail will be local authors, and we just happen to live in a town where I can say that with total assurance because there are so
So,
many, which
yeah.
is fantastic, and all of them with him as an exception will be living authors, and I think it's really lovely to have him sort of be holding the history of, you know, his own path and his own legacy in that way.
Here's another local author that you should put on your list is Norton Juster.
Yeah. Oh yes,
Yeah.
most definitely.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is, it's wonderful to, and this kind of for me harkens back to talking about Amherst. What I really pull out from our conversation about data and data points and being very enmeshed with the university, which, you know, it's not just a data challenge, it's almost an identity challenge that we have in town, that I've heard many people wonder aloud, kind of what is Amherst? Who are we as a community, kind of separate from higher education? Yes, higher education is a huge part of it. We love our schools, they are really important, all of that. But at the same time, I've had this wonderful opportunity to take a deep dive, and it really just keeps getting deeper into the community and culture of children's literature that is here. Illustrators, authors, the Carl Museum, you know, just I remember very vividly at the Common School reading, and especially reading local authors being a huge part of what we did. And so for me, that's starting to rise to the surface a little bit as identity in Amherst. And so the more conversations we can have in that context, with kids about, seeing other kids that are different than they are through their experience, through their appearance, through their history, through where they come from. It's opened up so many conversations about who we all are here. And maybe it's we're starting with no data. I don't know.
I guess I would push back a little bit by just saying we're not one community. We're not
fair
one
point. Very fair point. Very.
And there are people who talk about parallel communities in Amherst, and I think it's not even necessary that we be one community. Like if we want diversity, then we have diversity, and diversity means a bunch of communities. And we have Cambodians, we have Vietnamese, we have Latinx, we have so many different wonderful cultures living here. We have very old, elder, not old in terms of their ages, but like have lived in this town for generations, Black people. Who go back to the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, so every time, I mean, I've been here over 30 years and I feel like I'm not a newcomer, but compared to all of these, there's just so much. And I think it's a mistake to try to be one community.
I agree. I appreciate that correction. I think that is really, really crucial in talking about language.
Because then it's like who fits in that community and who doesn't.
Right. Right. Which is not at all the point.
Exactly. Exactly. It's
No, it's wonderful. And to the point about different languages being spoken as well, since the Story Walk went up, I've also had people reach out to share book lists with me that include bilingual books in Spanish. And I've been trying to find someone who might be able to help me with bilingual books in Korean and Cambodian, because those two languages come up a lot in conversations. So I think your point about community is very well taken. And I also want to give, a real nod and acknowledgement to people who are looking at the word equity in Amherst and what that really means. I'm on the equity task force of the Chamber of Commerce, and we had a whole session just talking about the word equity. Who are we really talking about? What are we talking about? What does equity mean between a large, really secure business right now and a small business that just had to lay everyone off? What's the equity between those two businesses, regardless of, the color of the owner or the gender or whatever? Right. What about their support system? So it's been really important, I think, to dive into language in this way.
Yeah. So I hope I can get this right. I heard this wonderful explanation of equity, which is different than equality.
Yes.
And so like, here's a fence.
Yeah.
And two people, have you heard this?
Yes, but share, I think it's.
And two people really want to look over the fence. So one person is tall and can see over the fence just naturally. The other person is short and needs a box to stand on to have equity in looking over the fence.
Right.
So that box is what allows the equity.
Right.
It doesn't mean that
they're both
it's a handout to the short person, or in some way they're less than because they aren't tall enough to look over the fence.
Right.
It's creating equity so they have the same opportunity.
Yeah.
And it takes the charge out of it. I thought that was a really cool way to describe it.
Yeah, it is. It's really, really helpful. So we're getting close to time. I don't want to take all your time, even though I feel like I could talk to you literally forever. I want to encourage everyone watching, please feel free to throw a last minute question out there. I'm going to ask one more and then let Marcie go. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them up there. And thank you everyone who's been participating. Marcie, definitely go over to our Mill District Facebook page. You can see everyone's comments and
I will. Yeah.
And the interaction, which is just awesome. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the True School, because I know that you do a lot of work there, and I think there's such a wonderful resource in the Valley. So can you, and I will share their website in the
Okay.
description of the video and everything, but can you tell us a little bit
I'd
about,
love to.
yeah.
Yeah, so this is their latest catalog that we're working with right now. It's called the Sojourner Truth School for Social Change Leadership. It's a big mouthful.
Yes.
And Andrea Avazian started this school. She's a longtime activist in the Valley. When she was on a train coming back from Austin, seeing her son and thinking, my God, Trump just got elected. What can I do? What can I do? So she created this school 4 years ago.
Wow.
The premise is, when we were face to face, the premise is that all of the classes were throughout the Valley in different libraries and church rooms and different venues.
That is awesome.
And people would come to the classes. The classes were all free and continue to be free.
Yeah.
And the trainers, first of all, at least one or the only trainer, if there are two, one has to be a person of color.
Mhm.
So it's not white people teaching people about movement building skills. It's people of color. And two, they all get paid.
Yes.
So that's another kind of, I think, very important piece. And the classes are usually about 2 hours long, and they're all throughout the week, evenings, weekends, and they're just very interesting. You can see the next schedule will be for the spring term, and the website is truthschool.org, and Hannah will put it up.
Yes.
But I have really, been very happy to be involved with them, and also brilliant people locally. And now with Zoom, we make it more broad in who our trainers are. But trainers like Ingrid Askew and Sid Jolly and Rose Saki Milligan and all these really cool people are doing these trainings. Yeah.
That's really wonderful. And Marcie, I'm sure that you hear this a lot, but I really appreciate and I'm so impressed with how involved you are and have been, and just the span of everything that you've done and how you've been able to kind of keep it in this really cohesive picture for yourself of how these spaces work together. And I just think it's wonderful that you've stayed so active in the community, your community, the community, for such a long time, the whole time you've been here.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Incredible.
Thank you.
So, let's see, I'm going to do one last look for questions. I don't see any. I really, really appreciate your time today. And
Oh, my pleasure.
About some hard stuff. This is really insightful.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I look forward to tuning into your show and following up on all of the really
so let's do a little plug for Going Deeper interviews. You can look at them through my website is marciesclove.com.
Yep.
And they're all there. Also, Amherst Media has done a lot of them, and Greenfield Community TV has also done some. So their websites also have them, but they're all comprehensively on my website.
That is so wonderful. I will post all of those links for everyone who's watching so that they can find them. Thank you so much. I hope you have a really wonderful rest of your day.
You too. You're awesome. Thank you.
You're awesome. I hope we get to talk again soon.
Me too. Me too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.